Hello, my name is Sophia Song. I lead cities research at Gensler. And today I'm very happy to be sitting here with Dan Doctoroff, who is currently the founder and CEO of Sidewalk Labs, former CEO of Bloomberg LP, and the former deputy mayor of economic development and rebuilding under Mayor Bloomberg. So thank you so much for joining me today, Dan.
It's great to be here. It's actually great to be anywhere other than home.
Exactly. So why don't I kick things off by asking you about Sidewalk Labs, because it's such an exciting company in my eyes. But what I would like to ask and hear from you directly is, what is Sidewalk Labs?
So Sidewalk Labs, simply put, is an urban innovation company, right? But what we do, I think, and the way we do it is completely unique. In fact, in some ways, I think defining the field of urban innovation from a corporate perspective. So we engage in placemaking, typically with developers and others. Out of that engagement, we develop insights about the future of the urban environment, from which we basically attempt to commercialize them, and we can talk about what some of those ideas actually are, by creating new companies. And then, in addition, we also can bring capital to bear to not just build those companies, but also as part of developments as we go forward.
So tell me a little bit about Sidewalk Toronto, because I think that's probably one of the most intriguing, exciting, urban development projects I've ever heard of in my career. So I'd love to hear more about it.
Well, unfortunately, it's not going forward, but for 2 years we worked with the people of Toronto, the governments of Toronto, Ontario, and Canada to develop a site on the waterfront on Lake Ontario that truly would be the most innovative new district in the world. Really an incredible combination of urban planning and innovation, all with the goal, obviously, of improving quality of life. And we spent a huge amount of time out of it, developed a really novel document called the Master Innovation and Development Plan that you can actually go and look up at online. Look up Master Innovation and Development Plan at, I think it's probably sidewalktoronto.ca. That really is a cookbook for the future of urbanism. Unfortunately, when the pandemic hit and the real estate markets went into disarray, we decided to withdraw because we didn't think we could make the financials work. At the end of the day, we are a company. We're sort of a dual mission company in that we exist to make urban life better, but at the same time, we actually want to earn a return. So we decided to withdraw, and now we're working with other developers. Can't say whom now.
Okay.
But more importantly, we are developing a whole set of products. Out of the exercise in Toronto, we created a company called Replica, which is a completely new way of modeling mobility flows in metropolitan areas that has actually been used by many cities and states, transit authorities, to look at where people are going and how, particularly during the pandemic. We're quite excited about it. Even before Toronto, out of sort of our analysis of urban life, we created a company called City Block, which is a new approach to urban health care. We are focused on mass timber buildings and are quite far along in sort of bringing that product to market. Just last week, we announced the launch of a company called Mesa, which uses a very sophisticated, privacy-sensitive sensor package to lower energy costs in buildings. We have a tool which we call generative design, which is used by planners to optimize among many, many factors: financial, environmental, space, et cetera, in developing master plans for areas. So really what we are said, we engage in the physical environment to develop insights, to develop products, and going to continue to do that.
Wow, that sounds fascinating and sounds like you've been very, very busy. I want to shift gears a little bit. A few years ago, not that long ago, you had written a book, Greater Than Ever, New York's Big Comeback. And I think it was more like a memoir of New York City's journey in economic recovery, revitalization after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And with this pandemic, I know it's another devastation from which New York has to come back from. But if you could just tell me like what you think are the parallels and differences between what New York City is facing today with the pandemic compared to back then with 9/11.
Yeah, I think this is really different. That said, as a backdrop, ultimately New York has been through, many crises over time. Literally, if you just look at, the last 20 years, you had 9/11, you had the financial crisis, you had Superstorm Sandy, and New York finds a way to come back. But this one, I think, is a little bit different. It's a little bit different because so much of our fundamental assumptions about urban life are actually being questioned or challenged. Unlike 9/11, New York isn't alone here. After 9/11, New York received $20 billion in federal aid. At least as of now, federal government is basically doing nothing for cities. But I think the other thing that's different about 9/11 compared to today is the times are different. The demands of people are different. Our whole philosophy after 9/11 was, you can grow your way out of the problem, in effect. That having more people in the city, whether that was residents and jobs, tourists, gave you sort of the additional financial resources to invest back into quality of life, which would attract more people into the city, perpetuating what we called the virtuous cycle of the successful city. Times are really different now. The concerns that people have are really different. We saw that last year in the decision to reject Amazon. We saw this a couple weeks ago. There was another major rezoning in South Brooklyn called Industry City that was defeated. People here in New York, I think in many other cities, are really skeptical about growth now. And so I think what's going to be necessary as we move forward is a new model for inclusive growth, growth that puts inclusivity, eliminating the inequities that have existed, that have built up over time, including ones that have been here forever, particularly racial inequities, at an equal seat at the table with growth. No city has really developed that model yet, certainly in the United States. And I think to recover successfully in New York, and by the way, to avoid slipping into a vicious cycle, which we have to remember can occur. In the 1970s, New York lost 800,000 people in one decade. In 1 year, we lost 13 Fortune 500 companies because that cycle went into reverse. We shrank, the budgets were constrained, we didn't invest in quality of life, it deteriorated, and more people, more companies, more jobs left, and it just got worse. And so we've got to avoid that. But the playbook that we used in the early 2000s after 9/11 won't work in the same way today because, in fact, over the last 20 years, people lost trust in growth, and we have to earn that back.
I remember under Bloomberg, population, there was an influx of population. Population was actually growing in New York City. And in recent years, that we've been losing population. And I also remember when you were deputy mayor, because we had this influx of population, there was a housing shortage.
So it's interesting. I think affordability is the single most important issue, but it's not the only issue. What's interesting is if you go back to the first campaign that Mike Bloomberg won back in 2001, affordable housing wasn't even an issue. Nobody even raised it, basically. And at the end of 2002, at the end of his first year in office, we announced a multi-billion-dollar affordable housing program, and everybody kind of scratched their heads and said, well, why spend all this money at a time when you don't actually have money on affordable housing? And we said, because New York's got to grow, and it's got to grow for everybody. We have to be able to accommodate people. And in fact, you know, up until the financial crisis, the affordability issue was sort of kept in check. What ended up happening was, with the financial crisis, people actually continued to come to New York, in part because we were generating so many jobs, and yet we couldn't produce enough housing, in part because the financing really wasn't available for it, and we created an imbalance, and housing prices skyrocketed. At the same time, homelessness increased. And so we have to find a way, I think, critical to this inclusive growth agenda is to produce dramatically more housing and do it at lower cost. And in order to do that, we're gonna have to innovate. Innovation is key, and it's not just technological innovation, which we can talk about, but it's regulatory innovation, it's financial innovation. All of those things are going to be necessary to overcome this problem. You know, you can solve a problem of whether it's gentrification or by shrinking. If you shrink, though, you've got to understand something. If you shrink, you die. And so we cannot put ourselves in, but that doesn't mean we grow in the same way we did.
That's true. When you think of thinking about work, you know, with this pandemic, what's happened is, you know, so many of us are working from home. And this pandemic has shown us that people can work effectively from home, and that physical proximity is really no longer a constraint. And so I wanted to ask you, you know, with companies like Twitter allowing their employees to work from home indefinitely, I know even with our own research at the Gensler Research Institute, people are willing to come back to the office, right? But it's just a matter of, you know, they would also like a hybrid model. They would like to work partially from home, partially in the office for the collaboration aspect, the socialization aspect. What do you think, what is your view about the future of workplace?
Well, I think it's going to shift. I think to some extent it was shifting already. I think in some cases we're going to see reversals of trends that were occurring before. Look, I suspect that at the end of the day, we won't have as many people in the workplace on any given day as we had before, even after people feel safe coming to work. Some jobs just don't really need to be done. I think people are increasingly recognizing that for many jobs, physical presence actually makes a difference, and it's very hard to define, and the lack of physical presence and connection, I think, is corrosive, but at a very slow level. Certainly the tools we have to work remotely have, you know, dramatically improved, but I think people also want to get back to the workplace. So, you know, a lot of their social networks are in the workplace, but I think most importantly for the companies and for the job that people want to do, the spontaneous interactions are actually really, really important. That said, I suspect virtually every company is going to very carefully evaluate who actually needs to be at work and how much they actually have to be at work. Offsetting that will be the fact that we're not going to go back, I think, to completely open offices anymore, you know, with 5-foot desks, and that's what we have, for example, at Sidewalk Labs. And you know, with social distancing, we can get like a third of our people in the office, which makes it almost not worth it in many ways. So the spaces are going to be done very differently. I know Gensler has been doing a lot of really smart thinking on that subject. And so if you said, like, what's demand for office space going to be, it'll obviously vary from company to company. It'll vary from place to place and how people get to work. But I don't think you'll see a massive decline in the need for space. It's just the space will be configured differently and it'll be used differently than it probably was in the past. This trend that we've been seeing over the last 20, 25 years, in many ways Bloomberg was a real pioneer of reducing the amount of square footage per person, is going to reverse itself. That's going to be one major reversal, which will offset to some extent the fewer number of people in the office on any given day.
So if there's a lower density of people coming in,
For sure.
What do you think that would mean for CBDs?
I think it's a negative for sure. There are a lot of people who rely on office workers who aren't office workers.
Exactly.
And I think that really hurts. So the question is, what can we do to kind of rethink retail, for example, for a post-pandemic era? Can we create greater density so that at the end of the day there's still as many people there, although they aren't occupying as much square footage as they did before? There aren't as many percentage of the companies, people are in there at a time. But I think it's a real concern. Big part of what attracts people to cities is the energy. New York, for example, we always said that the thing that made New York, New York was energy. If you ask anyone, kind of what's the first thing they notice about New York, it's the energy. And if we start to lose that, then we are in trouble, and we can't afford to lose that. So we're going to have to think of new ways of generating energy when the density, unless we figure out how to deal with density, is less.
Right. So love it or hate it, New York City Transit is pretty much the backbone of our city's economy. But with the pandemic, the lockdown, the slow reopening, and this perception of safety, we've seen transit ridership plummet. And today, transit ridership is roughly about 60-70% lower than what it was a year ago. And even with our research at the Gensler Institute, we see that while people are comfortable coming back to the office, their biggest concern is getting there, right? And it's using mass transit. And so with the loss of revenues, transit agencies like the MTA, they're going to be struggling. They'll be struggling to maintain their fleets, provide on-time, safe service. And so this impact will likely be felt for years to come, not just after the pandemic is over, but I would imagine for years to come. What can transit agencies do to come back?
Well, the first thing they're going to have to do is be much more prudent with the way they spend money. Not to be overly critical of, for example, the MTA, but there are a lot of places, I suspect, where they can spend money. Labor is a really critical issue, and how much you spend is going to determine the kind of service that you can actually provide. We know that there are new approaches from a technology perspective to actually make the systems operate more efficiently that historically we've been pretty slow to adopt. But, in fact, there may be some reduction in services, but I think that's the thing that we really want to avoid. We were just talking about New York and it being sort of about energy. It's also a 24-hour city. We cannot lose that. And so I think the last thing, over time that you want to really do is materially cut back service. There are non-transit related options that will be deployed more and more. To come here today, I took a city bike, and City Bike is now rolling out pedal assist city bikes, which make riding much easier, to be honest. I kid people when they do it like it's taking the easy way out, but it actually makes commuting much more simple and easy, and there's all sorts of things like that. Opening things up for scooters and others is possible. But I think the biggest issue is alternatives to heavy mass transit and the investment that requires. You know, VIA is a good example of a company that has developed like proprietary algorithms that create, in effect, a much more flexible mass transit system. I think that in particular will be especially important to getting people from harder to get to places into centers of opportunity without having to spend lots of money. The other thing that we have to think about is new revenue sources as well. Congestion pricing, which is something that we proposed back in 2007 and got defeated, actually, I think in 2008, has finally been approved in New York City. And so basically everybody, I think, who drives below 60th Street will pay I don't know what the number is now, but $8 or $10. And you know, could be generating $1 billion a year. Well, by the way, if you bond that revenue stream out, you can come up with a lot of money. It's unfortunate that we lost 12 years by rejecting it, because we predicted that this was going to happen in terms of not just congestion, but also kind of the system not being well maintained.
Right, that need for infrastructure investment.
But I think what's going to happen is we're going to find new ways of monetizing our streets in different ways, almost like congestion pricing on steroids. At Sidewalk, we created a company, Cord, that's working with a number of cities to think about creating virtual loading zones, for example, where they would charge for loading zones on a per-use basis in a way that hasn't been done before. And so the ability to monetize the streets in different ways based on desired kind of public policy goals, I think is also going to be something that we have the capability of doing today. There'll be issues for sure with privacy and other things, but you know, your willingness to try new things is to some extent a function of how desperate you are. And as you pointed out right now with our transit systems, we're really desperate. So we have to provide alternatives to transit. We have to find new ways, ultimately, of generating revenue for transit. And we have to find ways of making our transit systems more efficient. And if we do that, then hopefully what we can do is maintain sort of the service levels and keep the city being the kind of energy-filled place that it is on a 24-hour basis.
That I find this trend towards micromobility fascinating, just because, just like you, you know, I renewed my City Bike membership. And in this summer, I've gone on the electric motor scooters, right? That you can use with an app. And I know I just saw some ads recently for this subscription service where they allow you to, you get a scooter delivered to your door, and you can use this scooter unlimited for $40 a month. And this sense of micro mobility, I feel like, also supports this, you know, this movement. I guess everyone's been talking about the 20-minute city or the 15-minute city or the 15-minute neighborhood. And just getting with this micro mobility, it's not, you know, how fast you can get there, it's just how far you can get, even at slower speeds with bikes or scooters. And I'm wondering if, with options like this, if it lends to this defragmentation, like it fragments the city even more.
I don't think it fragments the city. I think what it does is give people more options, and people want options. I'm somebody who will always take the fastest way to get somewhere, no matter what it is. If it's walking, I'll do it. If it's riding a bike, I'll do it. If it's taking the subway, I'll do it. If it's taking a cab, I will do it. So from my office at Hudson Yards, this is now pre-pandemic, to Midtown, subway was a good option depending on where you were going, because we built a subway at Hudson Yards and it made good. But you know, for the most part, to get from Hudson Yards, which is at 30th Street and 10th Avenue, to Midtown, taking a bike was usually a third faster than any other mode. Certainly a lot faster than driving. And so I think the more ways we can find to get people where they want to go faster, the better off we actually are. And that's got to be our goal. Remember, it's always about the goal, right? The goal in the case of, I think, mobility is getting people places faster and safer. That's what our goals are. And people need greater convenience in their days. There's lots of people who spend just way too much time getting where they need to go, depriving them of time with their families or doing whatever else they want to do. So the more options we can provide them in a safe way, the better off we actually are. And I don't think that's inconsistent in a way with an effective mass transit system. But it does mean the mass transit systems are going to have to be smarter.
Right. And keeping people out of their cars, right?
Well, by the way, there are huge sustainability benefits from keeping people
Exactly.
outside of their cars. I do see a world in which there are many, many fewer cars on the streets, not just in New York, but other cities, which obviously provides environmental benefits, but I think gives us also the opportunity to take back the streets. You know, in a typical city, something like 30 to 40% of the streets or the land area is taken up with parking lots and streets. And so to the extent that we can recapture those, the quality of life goes up substantially. I mean, anyone who's like, again, being in New York, I know this is kind of New York centric, but this is true in many other cities. You know, the outdoor dining on the streets during the pandemic has been great.
It's been really good.
And, you know, a big part of that is taking back the streets and using them for other things. And I think we're going to have an opportunity to really do that. So, you know, raise revenue at the same time, potentially, by charging people for use of the streets, taking the streets back and giving them back to the people is a very, very powerful idea that I suspect from multiple perspectives, COVID-19 will accelerate.
Yes, we've seen COVID-19 accelerate many things. So, you know, the pandemic will ultimately come to an end, and certainly there'll be trends that will remain. And so as cities like New York recover, what are some of the long-term solutions that cities like New York should be thinking about so that, you know, it's not just livable, but it's also adaptable and resilient?
So, you know, from an adaptability perspective, I think that is going to be one of the key things, right? I think our sense of the future and the certainty of the future is going to change pretty significantly. And what that means is space and cities themselves need to be far more adaptable. A good example of that is retail. The retail environment was obviously changing before COVID with e-commerce. And retail is really important to maintaining the vibrancy of the street and the vibrancy of cities. But what you've got are retailers who are either suffering or nascent retailers who can't afford to enter into really long-term leases because the risk is too great. On the other hand, landlords don't want to lease out space for short periods of time because their renovation costs, if it doesn't work out or whatever, or if people just turn over, are too high. So how do you think about building, for example, greater flexibility into the entire retail environment? Well, to do that, you have to then rethink stuff like electricity. Why is it that our walls are so inflexible and take so much money and time to change? It's because we put wires into the walls. Well, you know, there are new innovations with respect to electricity, like something we've been working with at Sidewalk Labs, digital electricity that is much safer. It's delivered over Ethernet cables,
Wow.
much safer, and therefore the wires can be embedded in the baseboards, and you can design flexible wall systems around that, which enable you to have a far more flexible, whether it's retail or residential or whatever, environment. And so, we have to some extent go back to what we're trying to do. And in this case, it's have much greater flexibility in our retail environment so that we actually can fill up the space and keep our streets really livable and valuable and energetic. But sometimes it requires you thinking about whole sets of systems where the good news is today we do have new approaches that can be tried. The bad news is frequently they require regulatory change, which is why I said the key to this is innovation, but it can't just be about technology. It's about regulatory, it's about financial, it's starting to rethink things. And I suspect what will happen is that what we'll begin to see is be out of either desperation or an acknowledgement that we really do need to change, that we'll be far more open to new approaches than we would have been otherwise. That's one of the things about a crisis. You asked about 9/11, for example. 9/11, after 9/11, sort of people galvanized around the idea that New York should come back greater than ever. We're willing to do things that they really weren't prepared to do before.
They were very committed.
But it takes leadership. It takes, you've got that catalyst of a crisis, but leadership has to convince people that it's worth doing and that they should rally around an idea. And that hopefully is what we'll over time begin to see.
So what do you think what do you think the city should prioritize in terms of addressing, the fallout from the pandemic?
I think there's so many things.
I know.
As I said, what I think the key is inclusive growth, because we got to grow, but we know we have to do it in a different way. We have to correct the inequities that have developed over time. But the way in which we do that, I think, has got to take multiple forms. We've mentioned some of them. The transportation system's going to have to change. The way we deal with sustainability, particularly, by the way, for neighborhoods that have been disproportionately affected by sort of environmental injustice, if you will. Healthcare is going to have to change. As a result of COVID, we saw the disproportionate impacts on people of color and people in less advantaged neighborhoods. And we're going to have to find new approaches. And that's what inclusivity is, and is finding new approaches to some of these very long-standing problems, but also then recognizing and getting people to recognize the way to pay for some of this stuff is also to grow. So I think there's not one silver bullet here at all. If there is one thing that's most important in a city like New York, and it's true in a lot of other cities that have suffered from high cost, the biggest issue for sure is affordable housing. And there's no simple answer to affordable housing. So it's going to be a combination of financial, candidly, engineering of some sort and coming up with new sources of money at a time we don't have them. We did that, by the way, after 9/11. It's going to be technological. One of the reasons we're so focused on mass timber buildings is we think at scale you can produce them at maybe 20% less cost in much faster time, which is a huge benefit that can be translated into greater affordability. Thinking about space differently. Companies, for example, we invested in one that make robotic furniture that can make 500 square feet feel like 650 square feet. And in that, you actually get the feeling of more space at less cost. So, there's a lot of innovation that's out there, and I think we're going to have to try, because the number one issue we have in many of these cities is the affordability of housing. I also think we need to convince people, again, by also focusing on inclusion, that we need to be denser. And the way to do that is think about the way we zone things in the city, particularly around mass transit hubs.
I know, with this pandemic that, the concept of density has come under fire. People are now craving less dense environments. They're, even in New York, you go to real estate markets just an hour outside of New York City, and those markets are on fire because you have a lot of people trying to escape New York. What do you think about this trend? And
I don't think that's a trend necessarily. I think it's a reaction to a moment. I think that density is not the problem. Density in many ways is the answer. Look at many cities around the world, particularly in Asia, where they didn't suffer from COVID-19 the way we did here because they were either better prepared culturally, they responded to it or dealt with it in a different way. Seoul is infinitely more dense than New York is, and that COVID didn't affect them like it did us here. So I think people over time will recognize that. I think people see density as a plus when it acts like a plus. When you get the benefits of density, which are, energy, excitement, things to do, network effects, et cetera. The worry is that people will reevaluate the value proposition and decide that density isn't working, right? The things that they thought they were getting, they're not. And that's what some of the people are making a decision about right now. But they're doing it at the depth of the crisis.
Yes.
And so we don't know what's really going to happen once the crisis, once the pandemic abates. Hopefully what we won't do along the way is lose so much of the benefits of density that it will discourage people from actually coming back or staying. I think a lot of what you've seen is an acceleration of people who were thinking about leaving anyway, and it pushed them over the edge because we're in the middle of a pretty desperate situation.
Right.
I think New York, just again using New York as an example, every day on some level is getting better. Over the weekend, this past weekend, I went on a long bike ride, through New York, both up the west side of Manhattan and then down through upper Manhattan, and things felt, increasingly vibrant. I went through a long walk in Central Park on Saturday with a friend, and people were, I think really appropriately socially distancing, but it felt really good to be in the park. The next morning I went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And so the great things about New York are coming back, and I think as people begin to recognize that, their evaluation of the pluses and minuses will begin to shift again.
Yes, definitely. In the early days of the lockdown, I know many New Yorkers, including myself, we were rethinking those trade-offs we made in order to live in a city like New York, like things like outdoor space, a yard, more space to work from home, et cetera. But things like when the museum opened up, it really uplifted, I think, a lot of people.
Restaurants,
Yes.
now at least only at 25% capacity are open inside. And hopefully we won't see a material resurgence of COVID in the fall. And there's clearly a risk of that, but eventually it will, as you said, subside, and that'll be the true test. I think the real question is, can we avoid allowing the quality of life to really deteriorate in the meantime? Can we avoid really tipping into that vicious cycle like we had in the 70s? And I don't think we can assume that we can just go back to normal. I think we are going to have to rethink things as we've discussed. doesn't mean we lose the essence or the DNA of what makes New York or other large cities great, but that doesn't mean we can be passive and sit still and assume that things are going to go back to the way they were exactly either.
Yes. So speaking of all this innovation and tech, we saw very quickly with the pandemic that, tech has played such a huge role. In fact, in many cases, this pandemic has accelerated tech. We've seen it in terms of monitoring enforcement. We've seen it with IoT and smart buildings, and in terms of logistics, et cetera. So how do you imagine the role of technology in the future of cities?
I think a lot of what's happened was an acceleration of things that were happening before. And, I think in general, that's a good thing. And I think as we discussed earlier, that, out of a crisis, kind of innovation tends to flourish. And so I think what you'll see across sort of every aspect of the urban environment, whether that's buildings, sustainability systems, healthcare, and other sort of social infrastructure, in terms of the way we think about open space, the way we think about mobility, the ultimate digital kind of underpinnings of a lot of this, we will see an acceleration, and we'll see it across the board. Inevitably, it will not happen as quickly as we think, because getting things done in the physical environment, particularly in regulatorily burdened worlds, is really hard. But I suspect, what we're going to see is a real acceleration of sort of what I call the fourth urban technology revolution. If you think back to cities and you think about how they've evolved over the last couple hundred years, there have been three previous urban technology revolutions. One was the steam engine in the early part of the 19th century, which brought goods and people to cities and industrialized them. In the latter part of the 19th century, we had the electric grid, which made cities vertical, made them 24 hours by lighting them up, made them easier to get around in with subways and Ls and stuff, enabled mass communication. The third one, which occurred in the early part of the 20th century, was the automobile, which made cities easier to get in and out of. We really haven't had fundamental change in our cities in almost 100 years. Where we get our water from is the same, where we get our electricity from is largely the same, how we move around is the same, the way our apartments and buildings are built is basically the same. What's so interesting about this moment, and it's occurring at a time of kind of real global challenges, is we actually do have the technology to be able to rethink a lot of these systems. And so I do think what we're going to see is an acceleration of that, but it's not going to happen overnight. It'll take a generation or more to really kind of rethink the way we live in urban environments. Doesn't mean it isn't starting now and won't accelerate.
So this brings me to my last question.
Okay.
So the pandemic, in many ways, seems like it's a time when people's minds are potentially more open than ever to radical changes in how we live. And it could be seen as a reset, if you will, for urban living and urban behaviors. If there was something huge that you could do in New York City, something that you didn't think could be possible before, what would it be?
There's a lot of things that I think are now possible. As I said, I think the biggest issue we have is with the affordability of housing. And I said the answer to that is part regulatory through zoning and upzoning areas. Part of it is financial by coming up with new ways of monetizing, whether it's air rights or other things that could allow us to pay more for affordable housing. It is rethinking also the way buildings, as we talked about before, are really built to meaningfully lower the cost. I think if we put an all-out press on dramatically increasing the amount of housing at lower cost, it would fundamentally change the trajectory of New York. And I think it's doable.
That sounds very hopeful. I hope you're right. And so what's next for Sidewalk Labs?
I said, we are got 6 companies that we're hoping to launch over the course of the next several months. We continue to work with developers that help us develop these insights about new kind of products and services. So, our goal really is to come up with new approaches to meaningfully improve the affordability and sustainability of cities, and obviously with the goal of really impacting kind of the way people live in cities. And so we just have to keep that cycle working, that innovation engine working, and make it move faster.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. It was so exciting for me to speak with you today.
It was great to be here. Great to said at the very beginning, great to be anywhere.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Thanks.